Whether you want to be an aspiring web developer or you have been given a task to enhance your company's existing website, you must have to know HTML. Hi, my name is Mohammad Rizwan. I am a software engineer with over 15 years of professional web development experience. In this short course on HTML technology fundamentals, I will show you what HTML is and how we can make use of this technology to add semantic markup to the contents of our web pages. I will demonstrate the syntax of the language and the different HTML elements that we can use to better describe the contents to the browser applications. We will be going to start with the rough sketch or an initial mockup of the web page and then iteratively define the structure of the web document using elements of the HTML language. My goal for this course is to get you up and running quickly with the HTML markup language by making heavy use of illustrations that help remember the key language concepts. I hope you will enjoy this course and do remember to subscribe to this channel to receive latest updates. So without any further ado, let's get started. So before we actually roll out our sleeves and start exploring the HTML language, it is perhaps very important that we must understand the principles of the language in order to be fully aware of the context where this language outshines. The first principle dictates that, unlike the programming or scripting languages, where the intent is to write a program that comprises of multiple instructions for the purpose of executing them on the target operating system, HTML instead is a markup language that is used to give structure to the contents of the web pages by wrapping those contents inside HTML elements that have a special meaning for its wrapped contents. So instead of creating programs, we develop HTML documents that defines the structure of the web pages. HTML is targeted for browser applications and is not intended to run on top of operating systems. So the scope of the language is confined within the boundaries of the browsers, and these browsers are built upon the specifications of the HTML language, and so they understand how to parse the elements that constitutes the web page and how to further paint them on the screen for display to the end users. This illustration will come in handy to demonstrate how the browser works. So to start with, we provide the URL to the browser by typing it on the address bar. The fetch engine of the browser takes in the URL and locates the HTML document at the specified address on the web. Once located, it retrieves the document and store it into its cache, which is then picked up by the parse engine to create a document object model out of it, which is essentially a tree representation of the HTML nodes that constitutes the web page. Once created, the flow engine defines how the contents should be flowed on the screen by consulting the CSS styles attached with the document. CSS is a style sheet language that is used to address the presentational aspects of the web documents. In the same way, we use HTML to describe the structure of the web pages. Once the layout is created, the paint engine finally renders the contents on the screen that takes into account both the structure conveyed by the HTML elements as well as the associated styles defined in the style sheet language. The attached CSS styles could be the browser defaults or the ones explicitly provided by the author of the web page by having it included as part of the HTML document. CSS technology goes hand in hand with HTML in order to address the presentational aspects of the HTML elements. HTML is an interpreted language. What this means is that the HTML document is parsed by the browsers at runtime without first converting the document to some intermediate representation for different browsers. This makes the HTML language portable across browser applications. HTML language comprises of elements that can be applied to pieces of text to give them special meaning in the document. These elements are structural in the sense that they do not convey the presentational aspects to the browser in terms of how the different elements should be rendered on the screen. So these elements are presentation agnostic. These elements are meant to define the structure of the pages for browsers to correctly interpret the meanings of the contents and to properly format them for display on the screen. You can get up and running quickly with HTML in a matter of a few minutes. Once you get yourself familiarized with the basic structure of the HTML document and the surrounding rules of the language, the only other thing you will have to know is the handful of HTML elements and their attributes, and where it makes more sense to use one over another. CSS is a language of the web too, but unlike HTML, it is not a markup language. Instead, it is considered a style sheet language that goes hand in hand with HTML to define styles for its elements. We will be focusing on HTML throughout this course, but we'll touch on some aspects of CSS too as we progress through the course. JavaScript is called the scripting language of the web and is used to add interactivity to the web pages. Once the contents of the web pages are presented on the screen by the browsers, we can use JavaScript to interact with those contents in order to do all sorts of common stuff with them, like show hide the contents on button click, for example, or to filter out the available contents on the page based on the user provided search string. So the HTML documents employs JavaScript to add interactivity to the HTML elements in much the same way it makes use of the CSS technology for defining styles for its elements. You may have noticed that I have been consistently talking about giving structure to the web page up until now, and this illustration will help to demonstrate why structure matters. The figure on the left shows a document with unstructured contents. You can see that it is much harder to figure out what goes where and to separate out the different contents on the page. So dealing with unstructured data is certainly going to be a mess, and it further led to the reader frustration. On the other hand, the structured content makes the reading experience easier and more enjoyable. I have picked up some sample newspaper page just to demonstrate the concept that organizing contents this way has the implication that the data can be scanned more easily and the reader can be jumped to different sections on the page with ease. Additionally, I have pointed out different contents on the page and further labeled them with our own perceptions of these details. So at the very top of the page, we have the name of the newspaper publishing agency, USA Today, and is made more prominent than any other content on the page in order to make it stands out from others. This name is preceded by the company logo and have the tagline right beneath it. These details are for branding purposes only and are not considered a part of the main contents. Down below, we have the main content area where the information is split up into different sections, and to further make it obvious, they have used a line separator to separate these sections apart. The one on the top left depicts the main article on the page that contains the article headline, the author details, and the article contents. One thing worth looking here is that the article description not just contains a run of text, but it also includes the side note and makes use of the figure as well to better describe the contents to its audience. The right section is mostly covered by the image that signify its importance in the context of the page and is further elaborated with the accompanied title on the top and the caption on its bottom. Then on the bottom left, we have a stand-alone figure that is not included as part of any article, and the section on the bottom right covers yet another article that spans the same set of details we discussed for the other article on the page. One thing worth looking here is that some headlines are made more prominent than others that signifies the level of importance of that section over another. Another thing to notice here is that the contents on the page are presented based on their importance, with contents of higher precedence are appeared first. The role of HTML in the broader context of the web design is to give structure to the unstructured contents so that the browser correctly interpret and parse the details. We have been provided with a couple of elements by the HTML language, and all we have to do to properly structure our web document is to simply wrap its contents inside the HTML elements that best describe those contents. So to communicate to the browser that this is a headline, we wrap this text inside the HTML heading element. To tell the browser that this is perhaps an image element is made available to us for that same purpose. Likewise, to give structural meaning to this paragraph, we wrap it inside the paragraph element. In essence, we have been provided with a handful of HTML elements that essentially serve all our needs. Here, I would like to again re-emphasize the fact that the HTML elements are only to add structure to the web pages, and we have to consult CSS style sheet language and JavaScript programming language to change the look and feel of the web documents and further to add dynamic capabilities to those pages. I have taken the anatomy of a house from the real world to provide you with a clear distinction of what goes where. You will see little later in the course that adding semantic markup to the contents does not change its appearance on the page, and that is absolutely fine because HTML is not meant to cater presentational aspects. Instead, what we really need to be focused on is to explore the different elements offered by the HTML language and where it makes more sense to use one over another. So enough theoretical details. Now it is time to jump right in and discuss the syntactical rules of the language. To define an HTML element, all we have to do is to wrap the contents inside the opening and closing tags that we further highlighted for your convenience. The opening tag contains the name of the element surrounded by angle brackets. These element names signify some special meanings for the contents it wraps around. The closing tag is used to mark the end of the contents enclosed by the element. The syntax of the closing tag is very similar to that of an opening tag, except that the element name is now preceded by the forward slash. So both the opening and closing tags along with the inside contents is what defines an HTML element. So H1 here tells the browser to consider the text head first programming as a level 1 heading. HTML came up with 6 levels of headings, namely H1, H2, and up until H6 to give us the ability to mark headlines based on their level of importance on the page. So titles wrapped inside H1 are of utmost importance, while those surrounded by H6 signifies least importance. Next, I would like to illustrate the point that we can nest one element inside another. This way, we can associate multiple meanings to the same content. Syntactically, the thing that we must have to make sure in this case is that the nested elements opening and closing tags should fall within the boundaries of its enclosing element tags. It should never be the case that you place the nested element's opening tag before the opening tag of its enclosing element, and likewise it is considered the violation of the rule to place the closing tag of the nested element after the closing tag of its surrounding element. So here the term programming is further wrapped inside a B element that gives it yet another meaning, and in HTML vocabulary, B element is used to emphasize the text by making it bolder. One thing worth mentioning here is that there are some elements offered by the language that are merely presentational in nature. It means that they do not have any semantic meaning for its contents. The B element is one among those. It is just to communicate to the browser to make the wrapped text bolder. These elements are there from the early days of the web, and it is considered best to avoid using any such elements when authoring web pages because, as we mentioned earlier, the HTML language is used to add structure to the web pages, and all presentation related stuff will be handled by the CSS style sheet language. To achieve that same purpose of strongly emphasizing the text that have a semantic meaning as well, the HTML language offers an equivalent strong element. So the word programming, if wrapped inside the strong element, will have a strong emphasis when speak out by the assistive technologies like screen readers for visually impaired people. Here I would like to demonstrate the fact that the elements can also make use of the attributes to more precisely convey the meaning of the contents it contains, in addition to what was implicitly inferred by the browsers from the element name. Here, besides conveying that the inside contents is a heading by making use of the element name h1, we further communicate that the enclosed text is written in English language. This is extremely helpful for screen readers and other assistive devices. The best way to memorize the syntax of defining an attribute is to remember it in terms of key value pair, with key on the left side of the equals sign and the value on its right. So the key is called the property of the element in HTML vocabulary and is assigned a value that appears to the right of the equals sign. The provided value should be enclosed within double quotes. These attributes should be defined in the opening tag right after the element name, separated by a space. An element can define more than one attribute, and they should all be separated by spaces as well. Next, there are cases where the element does not require the content to be acted upon. Such elements would normally resolve to some sort of contents by themselves. Here is the example of an img tag that is instructed to go get the image from the path specified as the value of the src property and substitute this element with the actual image. Such elements are also called empty elements because it neither requires any contents nor does it requires the closing tag to mark the boundaries of the element. Now there are some attributes offered by HTML that have identical key and value. So the language has given us the provision that we can simply mention the key in that case and the browsers will correctly make a sense out of it. Next, this is how we define comments in HTML. Comments are used to leave notes to the HTML document to briefly describe the different sections on the page in our natural language. These are extremely helpful if we return to a code base after being away for long enough that we don't completely remember the way we structure our contents by that time. These comments are only for human consumption and are ignored by the browser interpreter. To comment out the text on the page, wrap it around these special markers that are highlighted for your convenience as well. Over here, I would like to go through some of the most frequently used HTML elements and where it makes more sense to use one over another. So if you have a run of text in the document, then it should all be wrapped inside p tag to communicate to the browser that this is indeed a paragraph and it should be treated as such. In fact, you know what? Any content on the page that is left to be marked out will be considered a paragraph by the browser applications. If the content spans multiple paragraphs, then each one will be marked individually with the p tag, or otherwise they will all be considered a single paragraph, and so it wouldn't respect the line breaks in that case and presenting us with a long running text instead. Next element we would like to discuss is the heading element. HTML provides us with 6 levels of headings starting from H1 up until H6, and these elements are used to wrap headlines based on their level of importance on the page. Think of these headings as sort of creating a table of contents for the sections defined on the page, with H1 represents the page level heading, and all headings that are considered less significant than H1 will then all be marked with the H2 tag and are included directly under H1 heading. And likewise, all H3 headings then goes directly under H2 headings, and so on so forth. The thing to remember here is that, generally speaking, there should only be one H1 element per page that accommodates all the other heading elements directly within, whereas there can be multiple occurrences of the heading elements H2 through H6. If the headlines denote the same level of importance on the page, then they should all be wrapped with the same heading element. These heading elements clearly depicts the level of importance of different sections on the page in much the same way the sections of the newspaper page are presented based on their importance on the page. These HTML heading elements implicitly creates a new section on the page and are used to divide contents on the page up into different sections. Next comes the link tag. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and the word hypertext in that phrase means that we have given the provision by the HTML language to link multiple pages together and further to jump seamlessly from page to page. This is considered one of the most fascinating feature in the early days of the web, and the word hypertext in the HTML makes it more evident as well. To make the content clickable, just wrap it inside an A tag and further use its href property to provide a link to the web page we would like to open when its wrapped content is clicked. Now the path to the HTML page could be an absolute path, or it can be a relative path as well. Here we define the path as absolute, meaning that the link is external to the website we are authoring. And to define such a link, we have to include the protocol as well as the host name as part of it. However, the relative path, which is not currently shown here for brevity's sake, define links to other web pages that corresponds to the same website. Moving on, to include images on the web page, we use img tag for that same purpose. It takes on a couple of attributes that essentially drives the resolution process. We defined a few of them here, like the src property is used to provide the location of the image, and the width and height properties are used to confine the image within the defined width and height. Lists in HTML are used to organize related contents together. They are categorized to fall in one of two types. Either the list is an ordered list, or it could be an unordered list as well. You may already be familiar with those types if you ever get a chance to work on the text processing applications like Microsoft Word, where we group the related contents together using either numbered list or a bulleted list. The concept is pretty much the same in HTML as well, but here we have to use the appropriate HTML elements to communicate this intent to the browsers. To make an unordered list that resembles much of a bulleted list in a word processing application, the UL element will contain all the related contents as part of it, and each individual string of text will then go inside an LI element in order to distinguish it from other related content. The syntax of defining an ordered list is exactly the same we use to define an unordered list, except that the UL tag is largely being replaced with OL tag in that case. Now you may ask where it makes more sense to use one type of list over another, and for this I would generally recommend to jumble up all the items in the list and then check to see if that still makes sense. If it does, then the unordered list is a perfect match for such contents. If that doesn't seems to work, like if the items define the route to follow to go from location A to location B, for example, or if the contents are the instructions to a cooking recipe, then the change in the sequence of the contents would simply not work, and we will be using the ordered list in that case. To divide the page contents up into rows and columns, HTML provides us with a couple of elements to semantically describe such organization of data. The top level element is the table tag that wraps around all the rows and columns that comprises the table. Each tr tag inside the table tag establishes a new table row, which then contains a number of table cells that each defines the appropriate table contents. The first table row contains the table header th elements that are meant to label the contents that appear in that column, while all subsequent table rows define the table definition td cells that corresponds to or comes directly under each one of the header cell elements defined at that same position within the first table row. So JavaScript Essential Training and Python First Look will go directly under the course offered table header that essentially describes the content this particular column will contain in a meaningful way. In my honest opinion, the best way to approach learning HTML is to first create an initial mockup or a rough sketch to start with, and then iteratively build a web page by narrowing down the focus to individual sections that we sketched out as part of defining the initial mockup design. We have used the Adobe Illustrator graphics editing tool to come up with the initial template design, but it is perfectly fine to hand sketch the design on paper if you are not accustomed to work with any such tools. The web page that we will be going to author during this course is for a fictitious technology education website that is meant to create and publish technology courses for its users and further enable the logged in users to rate these courses as well based on how well they describe the subject to their audience. A website is basically a collection of interlinked web pages. We will be focusing on structuring a single web page during this course, but all others follow the same guidelines as we demonstrate during the development of this web page. The mockup is designed in a way that it first includes the branding details. These pertains to the company that owns this website. Here we choose the name of the company to be the same as the name of our YouTube channel, namely Head First Programming. The company name would normally be accompanied by its logo and the tagline as well. Next, we have provided some links that takes the user to our sign-in page and have a link to the help page as well that lists down all the commonly asked questions and their answers. Down below, we have a couple of clickable links that acts as a main menu to let the user navigate between different pages of the website. We have intentionally changed the color of the courses link to black to signify that the contents that follows actually relates and being served under the courses section. Then we have a section that lists down a couple of skills and further enable us to filter out the courses to show only those that belongs to the category that have been marked as checked. If none of them are checked, the default behavior is to simply show all offered courses. The section on the right features all the courses offered by our company and enable us to search for any course by its title. Last but not the least, the section at the bottom of the page includes the copyright disclaimer text and other company relevant details. So the first step ever in authoring an HTML document is to create an initial template that will serve as a container to hold other HTML elements. For a document to qualify as a valid HTML document, it must have to define an HTML root element that includes both the head element as well as the body element as part of it. The head element is where all the invisible stuff goes. By invisible, I mean to say that all HTML elements that does not have any visual appearance and instead are meant to control certain aspects of the page would essentially be defined inside the head element. For example, we have a style element that contains all the CSS styles that we would like to apply to the HTML elements on the page. Likewise, we have elements that are meant to provide metadata that will essentially enable the search engines to make our website more accessible on the web. The body element is where all the visible content goes. It essentially wraps all the elements that we can see on the browser window. Furthermore, beside HTML elements, the language has provided us the means to declare instructional elements as well. These elements are also defined like an ordinary HTML element but have an exclamation mark right after the left angle bracket to indicate to the browser that what follows is an instruction conveyed by the author of the web page. Here, the keyword doc type followed by HTML is a way to tell the browser that what follows is an HTML document. All browsers require this instruction to be in place at the very beginning of the HTML document before they actually start parsing the HTML elements on the page. So an instructional doc type element followed by the HTML root element that wraps both the head element that defines all the invisible stuff as well as the visible part inside the body element is what defines a valid HTML document. The next step in the process of authoring an HTML document is to divide the page up into different sections. Identifying the logical sections in the page is an important part of defining the page structure. But the matter of the fact is that if you give the same mockup to 10 different designers and ask them to come up with the logical division of the page contents, the chances are that each will have their own solution that may completely differ from the others. So structuring the page into multiple logical sections is pretty much a decision of our own by conventions that are very strongly held in the HTML developer community. The page contents would likely be going to fall into a couple of generic sections, like the header would normally comprise the branding and the navigation details. The main content area covers the main contents on the page. The sidebar is related to the main content but is not directly part of it. And the footer section contains the copyright and other company relevant details. By following this pattern, we end up dividing our mockup into four discrete sections. The header incorporates the branding and the navigation links. There is quite a debate on whether the site navigation should be a part of the page header or is it deserves a separate section of its own. As I said earlier, this is merely going to be a personal choice. I tend to use it as part of the header though. Next, we have a separate section that lists down all the skill sets that essentially categorize the types of courses we offered with the ability to filter the courses to include only those that appears in the categories that have been marked as checked. Then there is a section that features all the courses we have created and published for our users. And finally, we have the footer that deserves a section of its own. Now the only HTML element that can be used to represent this logical division of content up into different sections in the HTML document is the div element. So here we have added four div elements to the HTML document that logically groups all the other elements on the page. Please be aware of the fact that the div element itself does not have any structural or semantic meanings attached to it. So it does not influence the web browsers to render its contents in any particular way. Its purpose in life is to logically separate out the contents of the web pages. Now, merely adding a div element does not provide us any clue of the types of contents it wraps around. To make the div element more descriptive, we add the ID attribute to each one of the div elements and assign them the values that best describes the inside contents. So ID equals page header means that all page level header elements will be wrapped by this div element, and the same is true for other div elements that follows. One thing worth mentioning about this ID attribute is that the value of this attribute should be unique in the context of the entire web document. So two elements with the same ID attribute value is not allowed. This attribute exists to uniquely identify an HTML element in the whole document. Later in the course, you will see that each one of these logical sections could define their own headers and footers as well, if that logically makes sense. And this is one of the reasons we name the top level header as page header and not just name it header, primarily to distinguish it from other section scoped headers defined on the page. As per the HTML specifications, the HTML document can have multiple headers and footers defined as part of it, as long as it adheres to the rules set for this pattern. Don't panic if it doesn't make sense to you for now. We will be going to address it in more detail later in this course. The only reason for me to have it mentioned over here is to make a point that what happens if we were to address multiple elements on the page that shares the same semantic meaning for its contents. We cannot use the ID attribute in that case, as it is defined to be unique per HTML document. So the other way to enhance the semantic meaning of the elements defined on the page is by making use of the class attribute. This attribute enables us to define the same value for multiple elements to indicate the fact that they all represent the same kind of contents. In essence, if the requirement is to address multiple elements on the page that shares the same semantic characteristics, then each will have to be labeled with the class attribute that have the same value defined for each one of those elements. One thing common about these ID and class attributes is that they both give us a way to guess at the contents it wraps around. One misconception about adding the ID and class attributes to the elements among the page authors is that the element will only be going to tag with the ID attribute if it needs to be equipped with some dynamic behavior so that the JavaScript would easily locate it on the page via its ID attribute. Likewise, it is a common misconception that the class attributes will only be included in the element if that element requires some sort of styling applied to it. However, this is not entirely true in reality. Though we can refer to the elements via its ID and class attributes, but the intention behind using these attributes is to enhance the semantic meaning of the elements. Moving on, we will now be going to add semantic markup to the contents of the web pages by focusing on one section at a time. But before heading towards it, I would like to make the elements of this web page more semantic by replacing the div element with its HTML5 counterpart. The latest version of HTML that we used to call HTML5 introduces a couple of sectioning elements to more precisely describe the logical structure of the web page to the web browsers. So it provides us with a header element that essentially replaces the HTML4 way of creating a div to logically separate out the header. Likewise, it brings to us the elements aside, main, and footer to wrap the sidebar, main contents, and footer elements respectively. So here we replaced each version of div with its HTML5 counterpart that describes the logical sections in a more meaningful way. Now, the next step in the process of authoring an HTML page is to establish a document outline, or you could say the table of content, by locating all the headings defined in the mockup and create a list out of it that better relate those headings together based on their level of importance on the page. By conventions, the name of the brand is generally considered the top level heading, which essentially provides a context for all the other headings defined on the page. So we take the brand name head first programming in this case and separately list it down over here. Then we moved on and figure out all the other headings defined on the page and came across two of them, skills and trending courses. We consider them as headings because they formally describe the sections they represent, and one could easily infer the inside contents of the sections from these headings. Now, both these headings denote the same level of importance on the page, primarily because they are presented at the same level on the page. So, with that in mind, we list them both over here. And since they are less significant than the top level page heading, we slightly push those headings inward in order to make this intent clear and further to better relate those headings together. Put another way, think of these headings would only make sense in the context of its parent. So when we say trending courses, it wouldn't stand on its own unless we relate it to the context, like all trending courses offered by the head first programming. The web page can span multiple headings based on the features it offers, but in our case, we only have three headings defined on our page. Once we are done with inspecting the mockup for possible page headings, the next step in the process is to format those headings in terms of defining them with the appropriate HTML heading elements. And here we did just that. Since H1 denotes the top level heading, so our page heading would essentially qualify to be wrapped inside the H1 element, while both skills and trending courses are less significant than H1, and since they share the same level on the page, they both deserved to be wrapped inside H2 element. Once we are done with marking these headings with appropriate HTML elements, it is now time to introduce these heading elements to the HTML document. And here we did just that. We just dropped in the headings to their appropriate sections of the web document. Now, the next step in the process of authoring an HTML document is to laser focused on each one of the identified sections and marked their inside contents with appropriate HTML elements. We start off by addressing the header elements first. Here we expand on the header element while not touch upon the other sections comprising the web page. I would like you to recall all the HTML elements we discussed earlier in this course and try to figure out the elements that can best describe these header contents. This is how I have marked these contents out. The image on the page that represents the company logo is described by this img tag that resolves to the image tw.png that is located inside the assets folder in the same directory where this HTML file resides, and the width and height properties limit the size of the image to the specified length in pixels. The title attribute of the img tag is used by screen readers to describe what the image is all about to the visually impaired people. The H1 element contains the page heading and the P element is used to represent the tagline. You may have noticed by now that all these three elements collectively describe the company's branding info, and it is advised to further group all such elements that have a shared goal of presenting out the related contents to its users. To merely group multiple HTML elements together, the HTML div element fits the bill in that case. The div element does not have any semantic meaning of its own and is simply used to group related pieces together. Here we did just that and further include the ID attribute as well to better describe the inside contents of this div element. To give structure to this piece of text, we again wrap it inside the paragraph tag and further decorate the sign in and help text with the link tags in order to make them both clickable. When the sign in link is clicked, the browser opens the signin.html page that is located in the same folder where the current HTML page resides. And likewise, help.html page will be shown when the user clicks this help link. Next, we have to describe the collection of links that let the user to navigate between different pages of the website. Here we introduce those navigation links to the document and individually wrap them inside an A element in order to make them clickable and enable them to jump to the page specified as value of its href property whenever the inside contents are clicked. Now, each one of the links are further included inside the list items of an unordered list. By first looking at it, you may ask, isn't it that this A tag is suffice to represent the navigation links and including them as part of the list would simply introduce an extra overhead of presenting such contents. But the matter of the fact is that even though the link tag is sufficient to add a semantic meaning to the navigation links, but they fail to convey to the browsers that all these links have a semantic relation to each other in a sense that they all collectively define the navigation across web pages. So there should be some mechanism in place to communicate this intent to the browsers, and the most suitable HTML element to group related contents together happens to be the list tag that describes association between its elements in a more meaningful way. Here we use an unordered list to represent such relation. Remember the trick we discussed earlier on finding out the appropriate list type that makes the most sense to be used in any particular context. Here is the recap. Just try to jumble up all the links and then check to see if that still makes sense. If that does, then the unordered list will fit the bill in that case, and it happens to fit nicely in our case as well. And for that same reason, we use the unordered list to represent these navigation links. Now, to further communicate to the browsers that these links are indeed the site-wide navigation links, HTML5 come up with the nav semantic element that essentially accommodates all the navigation links defined on the page, and we use the ID attribute here to further make this intent clear. Next section in the pipeline we would like to target is the sidebar. So here we just expand on the aside tag while not touch upon the other sections comprising the page. Even though we have already described all the header elements, but we intentionally leave it out over here in order to make room for the other contents on the page. Since this section lists down all the skills that pertains to the courses we offer to our users, so the best element to describe such list of items is none other than the list tag itself. And for that same reason, here again we make use of an unordered list to collectively describe the related pieces together. Each individual piece of text is preceded by a checkbox, and we have been provided with an input element by the HTML language to describe these checkboxes to the browsers. The input element is unique in the sense that it can take one of many different forms based on its type attribute. Here we would like the input element to act like a checkbox, so we explicitly mentioned it out over here to make it evident to the browsers that we need this input element to resolve to the checkbox and not to any of its other variant. Now is the time to focus our attention to the main content area of the page and start labeling the individual pieces with appropriate HTML elements to make them semantically correct. We intentionally cut the mockup down to only include the first three courses in the listing in order to preserve space for the code we use to describe these main contents. So here we use h2 heading element to describe the section heading. Use img tag to include this microscope image as part of the page main content, and further make use of this input tag of type search to put the search bar on the web page for the purpose of facilitating the user to search for any course by its title. Now, if you think in a way that the main contents in this section are indeed the courses we offer to our users, and these three elements are there merely to facilitate the users to better get a sense of what this section is all about, and to further assist them to search the main contents for the desired results. And by conventions, it is advised to group any such elements as part of the header tag to make it clear that even though they are included in the main content area, but they are not representing the main contents by any means. Now let's move on and describe the contents of each individual course with appropriate HTML elements. Since each occurrence of the course on the page shares the same structure, so we have defined one and left others out, and we use these dots in the HTML document to communicate the fact that these dots will eventually be replaced with the repeated occurrence of each course defined on the page. We use img tag here to define the course thumbnail, use paragraph element to describe both the course title and the course duration, and for the sake of completion, we use the img tag to represent the star ratings as well, though this will eventually be replaced with the JavaScript widget to make it interactive for the users that can then rate the courses subject to how well the course is described for its audience. Now, once all the pieces of an individual course are defined, we need some way to group them all in order to make it clear that all these pieces correspond to the same course, which would be hard to relate otherwise. Now, if there is a need to group elements together that are defined as part of the page main contents, then we have to choose one among the two grouping elements provided by the HTML language. It would either be an article or a section element. If you are following along with this course, you may ask why we wouldn't use one of these elements when grouping the branding details defined as part of the header and settled on using the div grouping element instead. The rule to follow here is that the article and section grouping elements will be used to group contents that are defined as part of the main content area. And for all other regions defined on the page, the div element is used for that same purpose. Now, the next question that one may ask is that should we go about using article or section to group related pieces together? Here is the litmus test. Does the content we want to group makes any sense of its own, or stating another way, if we pulled the content out of the page and use it elsewhere, does that still make sense? If the content makes sense on its own, then the article tag will be used in those cases, or else we will use the section grouping element instead. In our case, it makes perfect sense to wrap the individual courses inside the article tag because each course stands on its own and one could make a perfect sense out of it without the need to relate it to other contents defined on the page. Now that we have defined one course, the other courses in the listing will follow the same structural pattern. And once we are done with defining all the available courses, the next thing we would have to consider is to further group the individual articles together to communicate to the browser that all these articles are related in the sense that each one of the article depicts an individual course offered by the owning entity to its users. Now, to decide on which one of the two grouping elements would make sense in that case, article or section, we went through the litmus test one more time. Does all these courses, when pulled off of the page and put them elsewhere, still make sense of its own? No, it's not in this case because all these courses combined would essentially be related to the entity that owns these courses, and that is head first programming in our case. Since these courses as a whole needs the surrounding context for them to make sense, the section element will be the best fit in that case. And over here we did just that. One thing worth looking here is that when grouping the individual articles inside the section element, we also include the header element as part of that same grouping to more clearly describe the inside elements as part of defining the overall section element. Defining the footer is rather trivial. It contains just the copyright details and they will all go inside the HTML paragraph tag. So if you follow along this course, then congratulations, you have achieved the milestone of creating a valid HTML document from scratch. And I hope that the concepts presented in this course will certainly help you when you start authoring your own web documents. Here we would like to discuss some more elements that you occasionally find it useful as part of defining the overall HTML document. One among those is the line break element. If the content on your web page is somewhat related and you do not want to span it across multiple paragraph tags and yet want to introduce some hard returns to visually separate out the content as if they are defined as separate paragraphs, then the line break element will be there to do just that. You put the BR tag right where you want the text to break to the next line. Since this tag effectively resolves to a line break in the document, so it wouldn't need a closing tag as part of the element definition. There are times when there is a need to include those characters as part of the web contents that contradicts with the character set we use to define HTML language rules, like the left and right angle brackets that we use as part of defining the opening and closing HTML tags. Including these sorts of characters in the content stream would simply not work, and to counter this, the named character entities are used to serve that same purpose. These character entities are used to communicate to the browser to escape from the intended use of these characters and use them as literals instead. Each character entity is given a name and is preceded by ampersand to indicate to the browser that what follows is a character entity and it should be treated as such. The semicolon at the very end will then use to mark the end of the entity name. For left angle bracket, the entity name is lang, for example, and likewise for right angle bracket, it appears with the name rang. Since we use ampersand as part of representing the character entity, so it makes that character special too. And in order to represent this character literally as part of the web content, the AMP entity name did just that. In addition to denote the special characters, the named character entities can also be used to introduce additional white space characters in a run of text. By default, the HTML parser is instructed to simply trim off any extra white space characters that appears between words down to a single white space character. And if we were to introduce more than one space character in between the text in a stream of contents, the non-breaking space character NBSP will fulfill that need. Each occurrence of NBSP entity will resolve to a single white space character in the text. There are a handful of other named character entities as well that are used to cater some other essential needs, like we can use the copy character entity to include a copyright symbol in the web page. If the requirement is to highlight some text in the page, then the mark element is made available for that same purpose. And the pre-formatted text is used if there is a need to honor the format of the inside text, like for example to respect the spaces that appears within the text, which would be stripped off to a single white space character otherwise. We have discussed earlier the two most commonly used list types, ordered list and unordered list. In fact, HTML provides us with one more list type that is less commonly used, and we call it the definition list. You will occasionally see the contents organized using this list type when defining FAQs or glossaries, or where the related content needs to be organized in somewhat repeated fashion. In all such cases, the definition list will make the best fit. Within the definition list DL tag, we have a collection of definition term DT and definition DD tags, where the DT tag is used to represent the term and the related DD tag describes that term in some appropriate way. We discussed earlier in this course that the links are used to jump from one page to the other. However, there are times when there is a need to link between sections of the long standing page to let the user jump across those sections with ease. The term used to denote such relations between page sections are called fragment identifiers and is basically a two-step process. First, we mark all sections which we want to link to with an appropriate ID attribute. The second step in the process is to define links that points out to different sections on the page by mentioning the target section ID in the href attribute preceded by the hash symbol. So when these links are clicked, they will jump to display the appropriate sections defined on that same page. Now that you know exactly what HTML is and how to author an HTML document, it is now time to put all we discussed so far to the test. And for that, we need some text editor that better assist us in authoring an HTML document. Since an HTML page is nothing more than a simple text file with .html extension, so any text editor will suffice in this case. But we are using the Visual Studio Code for this purpose primarily because it facilitates the HTML developers in a number of ways. Like it tracks and report syntax errors, for example, if the document does not comply to the rules of the HTML language. To install Visual Studio Code, just go to the website code.visualstudio.com/download and download the latest version that is compatible with your operating system, and later install it with all the software defaults. Once done, just double click the program to open it, and then you will see the interface that resembles much of what you can see here. I have placed a reference down below in the description to the GitHub repository where you can find and download the folder that contains all the artifacts that you can see in this pane window. Once you are done with downloading the folder, just go to the File menu and click the Open folder. And here, locate the folder on the hard drive that you have just downloaded, and then click Select folder in order to open the selected folder in the Explorer window over here. This folder essentially features two HTML files, a CSS file, and an assets folder that contains all the images referred in the HTML document. Just click on any file and the contents of that file will then get appeared in this editor window. One thing worth mentioning here is that these two HTML files defines the same contents we discussed throughout this course. The only difference lies in the fact that we use styles in the index.html file in order to address the presentational aspects of the web page. And the way to do this is to make a reference to an external style sheet file, styles.css in this case, inside the head document, whereas the index-nostyle.html file is presentation agnostic in a way that it does not have any styles attached to it. And to clearly see a difference of how these two documents are being presented to the users by the browser applications, just right click on the file name for each one of these HTML files and choose copy path from the menu. Then go to the browser window and paste the path to the address bar over here and hit enter. Do the same for the other HTML file as well, and you will clearly see the difference between the two. We will be going to cover CSS technology in a separate title, but you can see how important it is to master the CSS language alongside HTML to better organize the contents of our website and for overall seamless user experience. So we are finally reaching to the end of the course. I would like to thank you for your time to watch it to the end and hope that this course takes your understanding to the next level. Before I say goodbye to you, I would like to request you to please subscribe to this channel for latest updates. Goodbye and see you in the upcoming courses.